Everyone, today we're going to talk about the movie Troy and its comparison to ancient Greek legend with Thomas Peaple joining us in the studio. Welcome back to the programme.
Hello.
Hello. What sources does Troy, the film, rely on?
Yes, I mean the movie Troy claims to be inspired, not based on, which is a term that's can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think it's generally agreed inspired is a admission of a loose adaptation, and it claims to be inspired by Homer's Iliad. However, as Homer's Iliad only covers part of the Trojan War, not all of it, and not the build-up to it, the makers of Troy have to go into other sources. Some of those are Homer's other works, so flashbacks or references in the Odyssey, but they've also had to rely on other Greek sources for other events. So, while I don't know, it's likely they would have had to look at Apollodorus' Library of Greek Mythology, Virgil's Aeneid for some possible info on the Trojan horse. So yeah, there would probably have been a myriad of sources, even if the most obvious one is Homer's Iliad.
So, do ancient sources give conflicting accounts of the Trojan War?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just start with the role of Helen of Troy before I even get into any other aspects of the war. According to Homer, she's sort of blameworthy, but apparently not. And King Priam blames the deities for starting the war, although it's not quite clear in what way and how. Now, Euripides, the Trojan women, very much portrays Helen as responsible for the war and the cause of the problem. Herodotus goes somewhere in between, because in his account, Helen of Troy does choose to go with Paris. However, as opposed to keeping it up for a decade, as happens in other sources, her crime is at least mitigated, not totally absolved, but mitigated by the fact that, according to Herodotus, it may have been a fairly short-term thing, because basically they run their way to Troy, and they stopped off at Egypt. And according to Herodotus, Paris is living at the court of the Pharaoh. When the Pharaoh finds out what Paris did, he basically says, right, I'm not going to kill you for stealing another man's wife because you're a guest, but I'm keeping Helen here and you have 3 days to get out. So then Paris goes back to Troy, and then the Greeks arrive and they tell Trojans, say, no, Helen's not here, but they just don't believe, but the Greeks, don't believe them. So they basically fight a 10-year war, at the end of which the Greeks break in and discover the Trojans were indeed telling the truth, that Helen was in Egypt the whole time. So in this version, Helen's behaviour becomes a bit more spur-of-the-moment, short-term. Euripides, however, in yet another play, Helen, goes even further. He claims that the real Helen was taken by Zeus to Egypt, while a phantom of her was taken to Troy with Paris, and it was all planned by Zeus simply so he could start a war and decrease the surplus population, to take the words of Ebenezer Scrooge. So, yeah, we have Women of Troy where Helen is pretty much entirely guilty, Herodotus where there's a bit of mitigation, and another play by the same person who wrote Women of Troy, now saying that actually Helen was completely blameless. So that's just Helen's role, and already we have at least 3 or 4 different conflicting accounts of her guilt.
Does Troy, the film, secularise the legend?
Very much so. It's sort of done fairly neatly early on that there's a scene where Hector is talking to the Council of Troy and he's accused of blasphemy, and Hector responds, I saw a man destroy the temple of Apollo. Apollo did not strike him down. The gods are not going to fight this war for us. So basically it's saying there may be deities, there may not be. The Greek deities, i.e. Zeus, Athena, Apollo and so on, may or may not be real, but if they are, they're staying out of this one, allowing the rest of the movie Troy to be primarily a story of human action, which is quite different to certainly some of the ancient Greek accounts. I mean, Homer's Iliad has Aphrodite actually fly in to grab Paris and stop him being killed, and then has the deities entice another man to attack one of the Greeks so that the fight goes on when it could have been prevented. Whereas in the movie Troy, Paris is saved by his brother Hector, who kills Menelaus in the process. So certainly compared to Homer, it is very secularised, and I've looked into it. Certainly the plays that Euripides writes about the Trojan War itself, as opposed to some he wrote about the aftermath, though not all, some of the ones about the aftermath still have deities in them, do involve a deity. So the Trojan women, the deities appear at the beginning, and in Helen, as I mentioned before, the role of deities is very clearly and very obviously presented. Now, the possible exception is Iphigenia at Ulis, where in the modern text no deities actually appear. However, there is some evidence that in early versions of the play, a deity did indeed come down and participate in the performance, but at some point the cranes broke, because in those days actors playing deities were lowered down via a crane, or an early form of a crane, and basically it's believed one night, or in one performance, the crane broke, so an alternative ending was written, where the deity's role is only described. So I think it's fair to say that even compared to, say, Euripides, Troy definitely secularizes the legend.
How does the film and legend compare in their depiction of the Trojan horse?
Well, the Trojan horse is not in Homer's Iliad. It's mentioned in a flashback in Homer's Odyssey, and it is referred to in Virgil's Aeneid, which is where we get probably the most famous line related to the Trojan horse. I fear the Greeks even when they bring me gifts, although obviously in Latin, which is often abbreviated to beware of Greeks bearing gifts. I'm going to give my best shot at the Latin. If anyone wants to correct in the comments, I believe it's something like Tomeo et Danis Donna Ferentes. If anyone can get it better than me, feel free to add that in the comments. But anyway, it is translated as I fear the Greeks even when they bring me gifts, and often nowadays abbreviated to beware of Greeks bearing gifts. But anyway, the point is you have these different accounts of the Trojan War from different sources, of the Trojan horse. The Aeneid rather, doesn't mention anything about Helen trying to tempt the Greeks to leave the horse, which is described in depth in Homer's Odyssey. So in that sense, the movie Troy's decision not to include certain bits is only making the same choice as the ancient sources seem to do. Similarly, there's nothing in Homer about a priest trying to dissuade the Trojans from doing so, and unfortunately getting attacked when he does. So, the fact that neither of these are mentioned there, it's perhaps only the latest person putting their own spin on it, rather than a contradiction per se. Now, the timing of events is definitely compressed. I mean, in Homer's Iliad, sorry, not Iliad, in the ancient sources, Achilles is dead before the Trojan horse. He doesn't enter, he isn't in the Trojan horse and gets killed in Troy. He died before the Trojan horse trick ever happened, whereas the movie compresses these two events by having Achilles killed during the final invasion of Troy by the Greeks. But that aside, and as I say, that is mostly an issue of compressing timelines rather than exactly changing something. It is a case of picking which version you want to go with on the Trojan horse itself. Although right afterwards we have a more interesting contradiction that Paris survives and runs off with Helen, whereas in the Greek sources she goes back to her husband. As far as I know, we have no classical source where she gets to stay with Paris. The Greek sources tend to agree that she did end up back with Menelaus, although in the account of Pausanias she was later hanged because when she sorry, basically she went travelling and perhaps didn't check her itinerary very carefully, so she ended up visiting a town where the queen's son had been killed in the Trojan War, and she takes vengeance on Helen by having her hanged. One of two instances of hanging, I believe, that we have from any classical source, the other being Odysseus' hanging of the maids.
Would Troy be a good film to watch for any aspiring classicist?
Troy's better to watch when you already have the groundwork of it. And I say this because Troy gets a lot of things wrong, so if you were trying to study the Iliad, you would be caught out a lot. And when I say wrong, I mean does a lot of things differently to, say, the Iliad. It's better to view Troy as the latest attempt to reinterpret the legend. So, as I mentioned before, Helen went from somewhat blameless to totally blameless. Over time, accounts of her being totally blameful seem to have become more common. And, obviously the Romans, many of which wanted to believe they were descendants of Aeneas, who appears briefly in the movie Troy, put their own slant on Helen in the Aeneid. In the Aeneid, she's a very, very wicked woman. In fact, Aeneas actually meets her second husband, because in this version, Paris died and she was given to one of his brothers. Aeneas meets the second husband of Helen in the underworld, who reveals to him that Helen betrayed him and had him killed. So in that sense, Troy is simply the latest reimagining of a well-known legend. So in Troy, it's sort of like Helen is now guilty, as in she did run off with Paris, but innocent in that she's run off from a husband who she would have been forced into marriage with, she never got a say about. And then his brother Agamemnon starts the war in Troy as an excuse to get Helen back, but really it's because he wants to conquer Troy, which shows that Helen is just almost, one might say, a pawn in the machinations of Agamemnon. So I would never say, if you're going to read the Iliad, start by watching the movie Troy, because you'd see so much the difference in the Iliad. But it's certainly a very interesting modern take on a legend that, as I say, the Greeks didn't always agree on either. I mean, for example, the Greek historian Thucydides later claimed that the only reason the Greeks took 10 years to conquer Troy was because they had to keep stopping to go foraging. That's hardly the 10-year war Homer implies. So yeah, Troy is interesting as a modern take or discussion of the legend. Another very good modern take in the same light, I would say, is The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which also gives its own spin on an existing canon. But yeah, it's very interesting if you already know how the Greeks told it. Not so good if you're learning how the Greeks told it for the first time.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and all the best to you in the future. Thank you to Thomas Peaple for joining us on the programme today, and thank you all for watching. Hope you all found something interesting in this talk, and it was lovely having you here.